Hello, welcome back to the ReThink podcast. This is your host, Cameron Friend, and we are so excited for you to be here today. And we're going to talk about why water justice matters. Now, the next generation of leadership is gearing up to lead humanity into the future. These are important times for Generation Z and millennials around the world because they are taking up leadership positions across all spectrums of life. This makes it imperative that King in nonviolence becomes the philosophy of our young leaders as they respond to challenges in the world. Next gen leaders are rising from across the world, and climate justice has been one of the preeminent points of contention in their protests. Water is the most important renewable resource in the world, yet the access to clean water is a constant fight as many government agencies and corporations are determined to control the access to water. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide struggle daily to provide clean drinking and bathing water for their families. But because of great organizations like Charity Water, it is becoming more accessible than ever. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." Today's our guest is going to be Scott Harrison, founder of Charity Water. Scott spent almost 10 years as a nightclub promoter in New York City before leaving to volunteer on a hospital ship off the coast of Liberia, West Africa, as a volunteer photojournalist. Returning home to New York City 2 years later, he founded the nonprofit organization Charity Water in 2006, turning his full attention to the global water crisis and the world's then 1.1 billion people without clean water to drink. He created public installations and innovative online fundraising platforms to spread international awareness of the issue. In 16 years, with the help of more than 1 million donors worldwide, Charity Water has raised more than 750 million and funded over 137,000 water projects in 29 countries. When completed, these projects will provide 17.4 million people with clean, safe drinking water. Scott has been recognized on Fortune magazine's list of 40 under 40, Forbes Impact 30, and Fast Company's 100 most creative people in business, where he earned the number 10 spot. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Thirst. Scott and his wife, Victoria, have 3 children, Jackson, Emma, and Lou. And just this year, Scott received the 2024 Beloved Community Salute to Greatness Humanitarian Award from the King Center. Welcome, Scott Harrison.
Cameron, it's great to be here. Thanks for letting me share.
Absolutely. Well, Scott, again, we are so thankful for you and the work that you're doing. And obviously at the King Center, we recognize the importance of the work that you're doing. And I think, number one, congratulations on receiving the award. I know that there have been a lot of challenges in your field. And I think it's something that a lot of people are coming to understand is more and more important as we're moving forward as a collective global society. Making water accessible to people is a priority. And I think it must be the most important priority moving forward with how things are happening. So, Scott, we're very deeply appreciative of everything that you've done.
Well, really grateful to have been with you at that incredible Beloved award ceremony. And there's so many extraordinary people doing extraordinary work. So thank you.
Absolutely. And so you created Charity Water after a decade of being a nightclub promoter. For you, what caused such a seismic shift in your thinking to just want to focus on water justice? And then what were some of the motivating factors that led to that change for you?
Yeah, well, in some ways, the decade of debauchery, the decade partying in New York City nightclubs was a departure from my youth. I was raised in a Christian home. I was an only child. My mom was very sick. She became sick when I was a young age. And I grew up as a caregiver, taking care of her. I went to Sunday school. I played piano in church. I didn't smoke. I didn't drink. I didn't cuss. And I was going to grow up and be a good Christian guy and a doctor so that I could cure my mom. So really, the 10 years of nightclub was the prodigal son cliche story. One day I woke up at 18 and said, I want to have fun. I want to break the rules. Religion isn't for me. I'm going to go and live a big, fun adventure. And that led me to this bizarre profession as a nightclub promoter, where you can get paid to get thousands of people inside nightclubs. And over the next decade, to the horror of my parents and church friends, I became, one of the top New York nightclub promoters, and I worked at 40 different clubs. Unfortunately, all the vices came with that territory. So it started with the smoking, and then the drinking, and then experimenting with drugs, and then the gambling and pornography, and really this kind of dark descent into hedonism. And 10 years into this, I woke up one day and realized, boy, I'm a mess. I am emotionally bankrupt. I'm spiritually bankrupt. I have done nothing for anyone else in 10 years. And I missed home. I wanted to come home in some way, home to that foundation of faith, home to the values of service and caring for others that my parents had tried to instill in me. So at 28, after a decade of just selfish, arrogant living, I sold everything I owned. And I had this idea. There was this concept of tithing that I've been brought up with, where you give 10% of your money. Well, I had this idea of 10% of my time. So I'd wasted 10 years, and I thought, what if I gave 1 year of life in service? Could I find a way to be useful to God? Could I find a way to be useful to others? I remember, reading in the book of James, there was this verse that said, true religion is to look after widows and orphans in their distress, and to keep yourself from being polluted. Well, I was 0 for 2. I had done nothing for a widow or orphan or anyone really suffering for 10 years. And not only was I a polluted individual, I was actually polluting others through the clubs and through the parties. So I had this idea, I'm going to tithe one of the 10 years. I eventually start applying to these famous humanitarian aid agencies I'd heard of, from the Red Cross to Doctors Without Borders to Save the Children. And it turned out nobody wanted a nightclub promoter. So I was denied by 10 organizations. But finally, one said yes. I could volunteer with them if I was willing to pay them $500 every month that I volunteered, and if I was willing to go live in post-war Liberia, West Africa. And I said, I'm in. Here's my credit card. You can bill me. And I took this position in West Africa as a photojournalist on a medical mission. And my job was going to be to take pictures and to tell stories of the incredible work that these doctors were engaged in. And these were doctors and surgeons who, instead of going on vacation with their family, had come to a post-war environment to offer free, life-saving medical services to people in need. And I fell in love with this community. I fell in love with this idea of being surrounded by people who consider others more important than themselves and are using their time and their talent sacrificially. And it wound up turning into 2 years. And of all of the things, Cameron, that I saw in that time in Africa, the one thing that struck me the most, the one thing that I just couldn't get out of my mind, was the fact that people were drinking dirty water. And I was living in a country where half of the people were drinking unthinkable water from open swamps, from muddy rivers, children sharing water with cows and with donkeys. And then I learned that half of the disease in the country was because people were drinking bad water, because they didn't have access to sanitation and hygiene. And I came back to New York City 2 years later, with a transformed life and this very clear mission, the one thing I thought I could raise my hand for and work on was a very simple idea. Let's bring clean water to every single person alive on the planet. And at the time, there were 1 billion people living without water.
Wow. I think that obviously that's incredible. And I think one of the things that I take away from that, Scott, is the power of storytelling. And I think, even in your genesis, as you begin this journey as from your youth, storytelling ingrained itself in you. And then in this 10-year process, you came back to these stories of these people that are a part of the gospel, that are a part of these stories in the New Testament, and what they did and what they were called to do for the sake of humanity, and then how that then birthed something inside of you. And Bishop T.D. Jakes talked about this idea of being pregnant with a purpose. And then
Yeah.
you had something inside of you that bore massive amounts of fruit, obviously. And so that's an amazing story to hear. And so since 2006, you've been working to end the global water crisis, and you funded 138,003 water projects, and with 17,490,802 people served in 29 different countries. Ending the global water crisis sounds like a very lofty goal, but a necessary one. So for you, how does the design of charity water make it possible to end the global water crisis?
Well, Cameron, I think, in some ways, what I didn't know turned out to work for us. So, imagine me now at the founding moment. I'm 30 years old. I was a club rat for 10 years, sold everything I owned. I come back after 2 years in West Africa serving as a volunteer, and I'm completely broke. But I have, I loved what you said. I love that TD Jakes idea, pregnant with purpose. I remember hearing somebody else say a holy discontent. Like it was just this thing that was not okay on my watch. I had seen a lot of things when I was living in Africa. I'd seen a lot of suffering, but it was just this idea that I could be a part of bringing life's most basic need, the most basic human need for life, which is clean water, to people with the rest of my life. And I didn't know how to start a charity. I actually got one of those books, Charities for Dummies, like how to start a 501c3 organization. And the people that I knew, they worked at, MTV at the time. They worked at the local bank. They hung out in clubs. And as I started talking to people about my passion for clean water, I realized that so many of them didn't trust charities. They didn't trust the system. There was this cynicism. There was this skepticism out there. If I give to a charity, how much of my money is actually going to reach the people in need? And I had this very simple idea, which turned out to be extraordinarily difficult. But it was a simple idea. What if I could design a new kind of charity business model where 100% of any donation we would ever take in from the public would go directly to building clean water projects and giving people access to clean water? And, people said at the time, well, that's a dumb idea. I mean, how would you pay a staff someday? How would you rent an office? How would you even buy the flights, to develop these programs around the world? And I said, well, I'm going to do that in a separately audited bank account. So almost 20 years ago, I walked down to a little bank in New York City and I opened up 2 separate bank accounts with a couple $100s each and said, we're never going to touch the public's money. 100% will always go directly to the people in need. And then somehow I'm going to find business leaders and entrepreneurs to pay for those unsexy overhead costs, the staff salaries and the flights and the toner for the Epson copy machine. And that was a really powerful, big idea. The second idea then was, what if we could just prove to people where their money went? What if we could build technology that tracked donations so that if a child donated $16.14, we could show the child, here's where your $16.14 went. It went to Malawi, or went to Uganda, or it went to Nepal. And we became the first charity just to publish all of the satellite images of our completed water projects up on Google Earth and then Google Maps, so people could see, here's where my money went. Here's the clean water flowing. And then the third big idea was just this belief that for the work around the world to be culturally appropriate, for it to be sustainable, it had to be led by the locals in each of these countries. No guy like me from New York City should be running around Uganda with a hard hat on, pretending I know how to drill a well. We could raise awareness. We could build a movement of compassionate people focused on bringing clean water to everybody. But the work in each of these countries would be locally led. The locals would be getting the credit. They'd be leading their communities and their countries forward. And we'd be creating thousands of local jobs as well in each of these countries as we scaled. So I kind of put these three things together: give away 100% of all donations, prove to people where the money goes, build up local leaders and give them the credit. And I started with a birthday. So I was turning 31, and the only idea I had was to throw a birthday party and invite people to come. And to come to the party, they had to donate $20. And a lot of people came because I emailed everybody I'd known over 10 years in clubs. And at the end of the night, we had $15,000 in cash. And we took 100% of that money and we built our very first of now actually over 150,000 water projects. And we went out there and we documented it, and we sent the photos and the GPS coordinates and even video back to those 700 people. And we said, you came, you gave $20, and here are the people drinking clean water because of you. And I really just tried to put that simple formula into the DNA of the organization. And now, as we've invited millions of people globally to take part in this, we've raised close to $1 billion. And soon we'll be closing in on 20 million people served. But it's really those simple ideas of just try to build a transparent organization that raises all that money for the overhead separately, and then invites people to bring the best of themselves to this issue, clean water. And what I love about clean water, Cameron, is it is one of the very few things that everyone can agree on. It is a universal common good. Republicans think it's a good idea, and Democrats think it's a good idea, and independents think it's a good idea. Faith communities will step up, and atheists and agnostics, right? Everybody can stand for clean water. And yet, as we record this, 703 million people, almost 1 in 10 people alive on the planet, do not have access to this basic need.
Wow. And maybe even just for the audience's understanding, when you say a water project, so like if you had $15,000 that went to one water project, what would that consist of? Like, what does that look like for a community?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are familiar with building wells. We have about 10 different technologies that we use across 29 countries. So it's really about finding the appropriate technology that is cost-effective and sustainable in that environment. In Africa, often there is tons of groundwater underneath these villages that don't have access to clean water. And it's a terrible irony when you know that thousands of people are living, poisoning themselves often with contaminated water. And the solution is 150 feet beneath the ground. But it requires about $1 million of drilling rigs and compressors and trucks. It requires teams of local skilled hydrogeologists who know how to drill the wells and find it and protect it and build them. And when we're able to do that in one scenario, you're able to impact hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives in a moment. It's hard to. I've been to Africa more than 55 times now. I've seen this with my eyes in countless communities. It is hard to convey the transformation that something as simple as clean water brings. In Rajasthan, India, we're working in the Thar Desert. We actually can't drill wells there because the water table is so deep. But there we're able to build rainwater harvesting systems, and we catch the monsoon rains. And during the peak of the dry season, people have enough water. We work in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia, where we run the largest bio sand filter program in the world. So think of this as kind of a locally constructed giant Brita filter that takes the surface water, which is plentiful but dirty, and it filters it, it purifies it for people. So, there's no silver bullet. There's no one size fits all water technology or water solution. but you can always get a result. It's one of the things that I love. I was just speaking to a bunch of children over the last week, starting as young as 5 years old. And I love telling kids, not a single person is alive on the planet who we don't know how to help. Okay, this isn't like some of these diseases where we're spending billions of dollars hoping to find a cure for Parkinson's or ALS or pancreatic cancer, which eventually took the life of my mom. The doctors had no idea how to help her. We know how to bring every human clean water. Now, we haven't created the will to do this, the global will to do this. We haven't mobilized the resources to do it, but we definitively know how. There's no one in the 703 million people right now who we'd scratch our heads and say, couldn't help them get water. Oh, they're beyond help. So that's what we've really been trying to do with Charity Water over 17 years is, invite people into a problem that really they haven't experienced. And that's probably the biggest challenge. And you mentioned storytelling, and that is such a core component of this. And nobody listening to this podcast, I'm betting, woke up this morning and said, my gosh, I'm just so grateful for the clean water that is coming out of the taps in my home. I'm grateful for the water that I brushed my teeth with, or that came out of my refrigerator, that I took a shower with, or that I used in my toilet, right? I need to do something today about the 700 million people who didn't share that. This is not a problem that most people experience. So it's really having to share stories of what it's like if you were unfortunate enough to have been born in the 10% of the world that doesn't have water. Your life would be so radically different.
Scott, there's so much to what you said that really stands out. And one of the parts in particular is that there's always a way to help. There's no community that can go without being helped. And I think the fact that you have so many different ways that you can find methods to provide clean, safe drinking water, it just shows, one, how important this is. Two, that this is something that we should be doing anyway. And I think a lot of this too, Scott, is, you talk about there are communities that we're born into that have access to the privilege of having water that's very accessible. But again, Dr. King has talked about the triple evils of the world: militarism, racism, and poverty. The things that have created these dysfunctionalities in our world are rooted in these triple evils that we have separated ourselves based on class, based on race, ethnicity, based on all of these social constructs. And all this stuff has led us to where we are right now. And the question I have following up for you, you mentioned this, approximately 700 million to 1 billion people, they lack access to clean water. So this has obviously been a major conversation for a number of times now. And, it's because of waste, there's pollution, there's other environmental factors that affect your ability to have access to clean water. But why is it so difficult? What is it that makes this such a perilous journey, it seems, to be able to provide clean water for people? Like, why is this even something that we're struggling with? If we have the access, we have the materials, we have the money worldwide, why is it such an issue for so many people?
Cameron, I wish I had a great answer to that question. I probably wouldn't be on this podcast and we wouldn't be talking about 700 million people without water. I think, in many of these countries, these are the most marginalized people in the world. It is the countries that would rank at the very bottom of the United Nations development chart that are the ones that are suffering the most. So, a lot of people ask me, what are the governments doing? The governments are building water projects, but they have a fraction of the resources needed. And they're looking at their budgets and they're saying, we also need to build schools. We need to build roads. We need to build power. We need to build health clinics. We need to make sure people have access to water. So, in so many of the countries, we are seeing these local governments try to step up, but have a fraction of the resources that they need to actually get these problems solved. And I think that's why philanthropic capital, that's why, people who are seeing the needs of others suffering, our brothers and sisters overseas, and reaching out our hands into other communities, as well as our local community, is really important. I joke sometimes that I think that there is a little bit of an irony of Elon Musk looking for water on a planet 140 million miles away. We are looking for water on Mars as we talk about making a colony sustainable. And as we go up into space and we look down on our planet, our blue planet, 10% of the humans live daily without the most basic need for life. So I'm hoping that there is a moment coming, a shift moment coming. I mean, there's not a single philanthropist of note in the world. Of all the billionaires out there, no one has raised their hand and said, I'm going to take water. I'm going to go work on water for 10% of the planet. I'm going to start putting my resources behind this. We don't have anything at a scale, that's needed. I mean, certainly people have made large and generous gifts, but water doesn't have its advocate, like women and girls have their advocates, like education, like climate. So I'm really hoping that the best is yet to come and we're able to grow the movement, invite more everyday people into this, invite people with massive resources, whether they be companies or foundations or ultra high net worth individuals, and say, let's do this. Like, let's do it. Let's get water to everybody, therefore impacting their health, therefore giving tens of millions, hundreds of millions of hours back to women and girls who are walking every day, saving the lives of children, improving the education at schools. Cameron, half of the schools in the developing world don't have clean water or toilets. I mean, imagine sending your teenage daughter to a school with no water and no sanitation facilities. Well, this is one of the top reasons why girls are dropping out of school throughout the developing world. They don't have water at their school, and it's their job culturally to go and get the water. And often the water is far from home. So I'm hopeful. I mean, we've been working at this for 17 years, and I'm hopeful that the best is yet to come and that we are going to see a tipping point and make a lot more progress. But we are not making the progress that we have said we're going to as a world. I mean, the UN goals, clean water for everyone by 2030. Well, we're in 2024 and we're 700 million people away. We are not going fast enough and we're not achieving the progress that we need to.
Yeah, and there are even examples of there are privately owned water systems in both developed and underdeveloped communities around the world. And this has caused a lot of, I think, a lack of trust from communities with whether it be governments, whether it be corporations. And, even just examples are here in the States where you obviously have what happened with Flint, Michigan, where there's just a fallout of a local governmental system that affects everyone in the community. And yet the community is like, well, where are the answers? Why is this still an issue? Why are we still suffering through this? In Jackson, Mississippi, I mean, you saw probably just a couple years ago when even Deion Sanders had to say something about it with the Jackson State football team. Like, well, why is our systems failing in the United States? And so for you, Scott, are there any policies or even things that are happening at the national level that the public should be aware of to help ensure that their communities or other communities have unmitigated access to clean water?
Yeah, we've been focused on the 700 million people who don't have access, living in actually specifically rural communities around the world. There are some organizations that are focused on these domestic issues, and you're right, there are some domestic issues. When Charity Water looked at Flint, what was actually needed was over $1 billion of infrastructure pipe repair. That wasn't something that we had in our kind of specialty area. So we wound up referring our community to a bunch of local organizations who were doing great work in Flint. Said, don't give us any money. Here are a bunch of local organizations who have deep ties with these communities and are finding solutions. There's a group called Dig Deep that is focused on some of these policy issues and some of these issues in America that people could check out. But I think, the theme that I would encourage is, this is a precious resource, is really to heighten the awareness around this thing that, again, so many people take for granted. It's just there. I think it was Benjamin Franklin that said many, many, many years ago, he said, it's when the well goes dry, it's only then that we realize the value of water. And, Flint is a well going dry. Jackson is a well going dry. 700 million people around the world, their well went dry. They were born into situations where their well went dry. And I think encouraging more people to understand this issue, understanding it in their local communities here, understanding this issue in the global community, and then taking that education and becoming advocates for clean water. Again, I keep saying this, but it is, if you really think about it, it is the most basic building block. It is the number one thing you need for human life. You can go months without food sometimes and days without water. And as I travel around the world, I've been to 72 countries now. And the three words that I hear, most common three words, no matter what country I'm in, no matter what community I'm in the local language, it's water is life. Water is life. People understand this. And what we need to do is to make sure that every human being alive has the clean water that they need for their life. And we're still a far cry away from solving this.
So Scott, when you think about yourself personally, and obviously, with Charity Water, what kind of mark do you want to leave as a leader? And how have you chosen to use your life to build the beloved community where you are? And then how do you feel that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mr. Coretta Scott King, the teachings of nonviolence, how do you feel like their work has impacted you in the way that you view your leadership and your gifts to the world?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'm fortunate that I found my way again, because had I died at 28 years old, the only thing you would have written on my tombstone is, "Here lies a selfish man who's gotten a million people wasted." That was the only thing that my life would have stood for. And, 17 years later, I've been blessed with an amazing wife and 3 children. And I got to take my kids to Africa at 6 and 8 years old last year for the first time, and bring them in communities of need, bring them around our local well drillers, and to see the solutions and to see these inspiring local leaders. I really think, what's resonated so much about Dr. Martin Luther King's Jr.'s life and his teachings in the King Center is just, it is the call to service. It is the call to put others before ourselves. It is the call to be constantly asking ourselves the question, how can I help? How can I use my God-given talent, my time, my money? How can I use these things in the service of others, in the service of others in my local community, in the service of the global community? And I'll never forget, somebody sent me this picture of a quote outside a New York City deli almost 20 years ago. And it came from an ancient rabbinic text. And I think this is so in line with the King Center philosophy and so many of these teachings. And the quote said, "Do not be afraid of work with no end." Do not be afraid of work with no end. And I think that if you are trying to pour yourself out for others, if you are trying to constantly put the needs of others first, there is no finish line. There is no drop the mic moment. There's no, I've done enough and now it's time to go be selfish. Now it's go time to, focus on myself. And I think if you can live a life with that intention of being useful, of being a blessing, of service, you're able to look back one day and maybe be almost surprised at what you've been able to accomplish. And 17 million people. I mean, look, on a bad day, my trick is I try to fill stadiums full of people that Charity Water Community has given clean water. So it's about 1,000 Madison Square Gardens now. You'd have to build 1,000 of my local stadium in New York City to contain 18 million people. If I were going to spend 1 minute meeting 18 million people and talking to them about how their life is different with clean water, and if I didn't stop to drink or to eat or to sleep, and I just met 18 million people, it would take over 35 years to meet the people who've been impacted. But I spend 99% of my time thinking about how little we've done in the face of this enormous problem. You put 18 million people into 700 million people, and it's about 139th of the way there, 2.5% to goal. And I think hopefully that ambition to really, I mean, we mean it when we say it, to realize a day on earth when no one drinks dirty water, when every man, every woman, every child, regardless of where they were born, has this basic need met. I think it's, hopefully at the end of my life, I get to look back and say, I'm glad that we pursued this, unbelievably audacious goal. Did we get there? I hope. But, even if we didn't, millions and millions, hopefully tens of millions, maybe over 100 million lives will eventually be changed. And I try to teach that to my kids as well.
Scott, that is amazing, and I absolutely salute that effort. And I think that is a life well lived. And so I deeply appreciate that. And Scott, as we're ending and as we're wrapping up, we're headed into a new place. I mean, we're on the precipice. I mean, Gen Z is stepping up. They're in leadership positions. Millennials, they're here full bore. Alpha is right below. They're coming right below. They're right behind them. They're going to be getting high school and all this other stuff. So the generations that are kind of going to be spearheading a lot of this, they're right there and they're on the cusp. So for you, as you're ending, what is the next step, do you think, for them in ending the global water crisis? And how would you encourage for these next generation leaders to continue to pick up the mantle and the baton to keep this fight going?
Yeah, well, I'm so encouraged that I have never seen more interest from the youth than at this moment in time. Charity Water hired 36 people last year, and we had over 13,500 full applicants for those positions. 13,500 people said, I want my job to be a job with purpose. I want to work in the service of others. I'm willing to make less money than I would in the corporate world. And I think I'm so encouraged by this. I'm so encouraged by the young kids. I mean, we have seen 6-year-olds send their allowance into the office. A little girl sent in $8.15. There was a girl, I think she was 7 years old, in Vancouver, Canada, and she did 12 lemonade stands. And her mom said she refused to come in even when it was raining because she believed that she could sell lemonade that would get other children access to clean water. And I'm constantly inspired by, I'm almost 50 now, so I've got gray hair, and I'm certainly, not winning any under 40 awards. The youth have a passion, they have a creativity, and I would just encourage people to, learn more about these issues, whether it's a justice issue, whether it's a global issue like water, which is also clearly a justice issue. Become really informed, take a deeper dive than just the cursory kind of 30,000 foot view of that issue. Understand it, learn it, and then go and engage with your time and your talent and your money. And, it's really important for me as well to be a donor to Charity Water. When I wrote the book, I donated the entire book advance, all the proceeds of the book, domestically and internationally. So I can never make a penny of this. And my wife and I have been blessed that we've been able to sponsor many different water projects in communities around the world. And it is a real joy to just these three things: your time and your talent and your money. And if you could put all three of these together in the service of others, and you're really on your way to a life well lived, a life that your kids and your grandkids one day can be proud of.
Your time, your talent, and your money. And Scott, thank you so much. You have truly given us so much to think about and given us an opportunity to learn and to dive deeper into something that is of incredible importance for all of us around the globe as global citizens and members of the World House. So thank you so much, Scott.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to share.
Absolutely. Well, y'all, this is the ReThink podcast. These are the kind of conversations we have. You've been here. You know that. We have more coming up. Scott Harrison, again, Charity Water, just a great organization. If you want to be invested in Charity Water, you can find them on our website. You can go to their website as well, and then you can continue to tap in all the great work they're doing around the world. Make sure y'all are liking, sharing, subscribing. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast on Spotify and on Apple. Give us 5-star reviews. That way people can learn about all the great things that are happening around the world through the King Center's ReThink podcast. Y'all, we thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.